Good afternoon. My name is Amanda Soa, and I'm a student project manager at the Clark Firm for Contemporary Issues at Dickinson College. On behalf of the Clark Firm, I'd like to welcome you to today's event. Why are we optimistically biased about our risks? Application to the coronavirus pandemic. Our speaker this afternoon, Marie Helweg-Larsen, is a professor of psychology in the Glenn E. and Mary Todd Chair in the Social Sciences at Dickinson College. She's also the resident director of Dickinson's Norwich Science Program in England. As a researcher, she focuses on social, health, and cross-cultural psychology. Currently, she has a 3-year grant from the National Institute of Health to study how the impacts of stigmatization within cultural and social statuses affect smokers. She has published a paper on the stability of optimistic beliefs, both across time and across types of events, examined if perceived risk predicts behavioral change, and has studied the prevalence estimates and prototype perceptions related to health risk behaviors. In the 2015-2016 academic year, she won the Dickinson Award for Distinguished Teaching. All the way from England, Professor Helweg-Larsen will introduce us to the concept of optimistic bias, which is the belief that one is less susceptible to danger than rational analysis would suggest. She attributes this way of thinking to the personal experiences of an individual risk and the risk perception they have developed. Professor Helweg-Larsen cites that this might not be a fully negative reaction to the current global pandemic, as it is also a coping mechanism to reduce stress and gain a sense of control. She advocates for the use of moral reasoning to convince those who are optimistic biased about the risk they pose to others. There will be a question and answer session immediately following the program, so please type your questions in the live chat next to this YouTube video. Sarah DiMuccio, our Clark Firm student co-supervisor, will be moderating the questions. Thank you so much for attending. We will now begin the presentation.
Hello, everyone. I am coming to you from Norwich, England, where I am currently living. And the Dickinson students have been at home, but I continue to teach them. So I look forward to your questions. Please do type them in along the way, and they will be read aloud at the end. So my talk today is why are we optimistically biased about our risks and what are the applications to the coronavirus pandemic? So here's an outline of my talk today. So the first question is, what is the optimistic bias? Many people wonder whether people are in denial. Why do people show an optimistic bias? What difference does experience make? And why are risk perceptions so important? I also want to talk to you about a new study that I'm just starting now on optimistic bias and risk in the coronavirus. And then I want to end by talking to you a little bit about risk communication and what the differences are between lay people and experts and the challenges of how to actually talk to the public about risk. So let's start. So you might have seen reports of students partying rather than social distancing in beaches in Florida for spring break. This was widely covered in the news. And you might have, as many people did, wondered why. Like, didn't they actually know that there was a global pandemic? Did they not think about the consequences of their action? And there are probably many reasons, but one reason that we'll focus on today is that they might not have thought that they were personally at risk of coronavirus infection. And they probably saw their risk as less than that of other people. So let's start with a definition. What is the optimistic bias? It's really pretty simple. People tend to think that they're less at risk than other people. So there are thousands of studies that have been conducted in the last 30 years about optimistic bias, how to measure it, what makes it go up and down, how is it related to other variables, and when does it predict people's behavior. So let's just try it out for a moment. So here's your question that I want you out there all to answer. So it's pretty simple. Question one is, what's the chance that you'll get injured in a car accident in the next year? From not at all likely to very likely. And then question two is, what is the chance that the typical person, your gender and age, will get injured in a car accident in the next year? From not at all likely to very likely. So why don't you out there write down or remember a number from 1 to 5 on the first question, and then a number from 1 to 5 on the second question. All right, I assume that you have accomplished this task. So I'm now guessing that some of you gave the same number for both questions. Some of you put 1 to both, or 5 to both, or 3 to both. But I bet that more of you probably gave a lower number on the first question than you did on the second question. So you might have given a 2, that you were not so likely to get in a car accident, but perhaps you thought that the typical person of your gender and age was a 3. And if you thought that your own risk was less than that of other people, you might have had many reasonable arguments for why that's the case. Maybe you think I don't drive that much, or maybe you don't drive at all. Maybe it has never happened to you before. Maybe you're an excellent driver. Maybe you're a fantastic driver, or so you feel. So some of these points probably are true. Maybe it is true that you're less likely to get injured in an accident if you drive less, but you might also forget that many other people also don't drive that often. So the point is that although you might be correct, you're also biased, because on average, everyone cannot be less at risk than everyone else. So this is an example from car accidents. We do in fact find that people rate their risk as less likely than other people of getting in a car accident. And that's actually true even for people who were just in a car accident, interestingly. They were actually asked in a study at the DMV about their risks. So, but the bias, of course, is not unique to car accidents. Just in my own research, we have found it to be pervasive. So people are, in fact, optimistically biased in that college students who have never been married think that they are more likely than other people to have a happy marriage, and they are less likely to divorce. Students think that they're less likely than other students to have an unplanned pregnancy, to get a sexually transmitted disease, or get HIV and AIDS. Students also think they're less likely to fall victim to interpersonal violence in their dating relationships than compared to other students. In a study in which we looked at men and women who were at high risk of having a heart attack or stroke because they had uncontrolled hypertension, people also thought that they were less at risk than other people like them from having a heart attack or stroke. Much research shows among smokers that they think they're less likely to get lung cancer than other smokers. And this has been studied with many other illnesses and diseases. And you can see Helweg-Larsen and Shepard for a review. So we know that this is common and pervasive, but what about the coronavirus? So as you know, this is a relatively recent crisis, but researchers have already been collecting data on what people's risk beliefs are, specifically about the coronavirus. So in a study conducted in February of 2020, so just a couple of months ago, this was before the major outbreaks happened and closures in Europe. There was a large study of Europeans who were located in France, Italy, the UK, and Switzerland, 4,000 in all. And what they asked was simply very similar to a question I just asked, namely, what did people think their likelihood was of getting the coronavirus? And what did they think other people in their own country, so the French were asked about the likelihood of people in France getting it and so on. And results showed that 50% of the participants thought that they were less likely than other people in their own country of getting infected. And only 5% of respondents thought that they were more likely to be infected than other people in their country. Now you might say, yes, that's clearly a bias skewed towards being optimistically biased, but still 45% saw their risk similar to that of other people, perhaps the way you yourself did when I asked the questions about the risk of getting in a car accident. So were they then realistic? So they might actually still have been unrealistically biased, even though, just like people in any category, because we don't know whether people actually are at risk of getting the virus. So if you think that your risk is the same as that of other people, you might of course be incorrect, because you are at greater risk because you have a job in which you're exposed to people, for example, who might have the virus. Or you might think that you are less at risk than other people, but really that's incorrect. So what's important about this particular way of measuring optimistic bias is that we can't necessarily tell whether each person is correct or incorrect, but rather as a group, everyone can't be less at risk than everyone else, which is exactly what this study showed. So you might wonder whether people then adjust their risk beliefs over time. So what's happening right now is that there's a tremendous amount of information about the corona risk that's changing every day. And even people who don't pay close attention to the news might have noticed or been informed that things were getting worse. So the short answer to this is that yes, people do change their risk beliefs in response to information about increasing coronavirus infections and death. And we see this pattern in a different study that was conducted in mid-March of 1,600 Americans. And let me just show you the results on a slide rather than describe them. So let me first orient you to this slide. So the y-axis is showing a 100 point scale. So it was not labeled as a percentage, but a point. And in this case, it was simply labeled from very unlikely to likely. So actually it was just labeled from unlikely to likely. And so the y-axis here is just shown from 35 to 70, but the scale was from 0 to 100. The y-axis just shows 2 points, and these are dates. So in the first point is March 11th, and 5 days later, the very same people were asked on March 16th, this same question. So this is within subjects. And then let me orient you to the colors. So the self is how people answered the question, what do you think your likelihood is of getting the coronavirus infection? And as you can tell, the bar went up. So the bottom purple bar goes from lower to higher, just across a time span of 5 days. So people were clearly responding to increased perception. You can tell also that when these people rated the perception of people in their neighborhood, which is the purple bar, it also went up. And when people rated the likelihood either of the state's average of coronavirus infection, likelihood of a person in their state, or a person in the United States, those two bars overlap, so they did not distinguish between state and the US as a whole. So what's interesting about this graph is that yes, people are responding by moving their estimates up, but you can also tell that they are responding by moving everyone's estimates up, including their own. So the optimistic bias is still very clear because the difference between, in this case, most likely the yellow point and the purple point at the first time period is the same distance approximately as it is at the second time period. In other words, this research shows that although people thought their own personal risk was increasing, they also saw everyone else's risk as increasing, and therefore people still thought that they were optimistically biased. In other words, people showed a bias because they still thought they were less at risk than other people. So it's an interesting example from very recent data that people adjust, but they adjust imperfectly. So moving on into the next point, you might wonder, well, are people in complete denial? I mean, are they not understanding? And the research clearly shows that people are biased, but not in complete denial. So you could say that people wear rose-colored glasses. They see the world in a favorable way that's not completely divorced from reality, but is still optimistic. So much of the research, including my own, shows this pattern. So for example, among smokers, very much knew or know that their smoking is dangerous, and they rated their own risk of personal risk for lung cancer as greater than that of a non-smoker. But they still rate their own risk of getting lung cancer as lower than they rate the risk of other smokers getting lung cancer. In other words, they realize that there's some danger, but still think that they're better off than other smokers like themselves. So people adjust their beliefs to their circumstances, but often inadequately. Let me show you data from another study in which I simply asked smokers what they thought their personal risk was of getting lung cancer. I used a 7-point scale from not at all likely to very likely. And then I just looked at how much the smokers actually smoked. So let me show you the data for this. So here we have the graph. And again, the y-axis is from 1 to 6. The scale was from 1 to 7. It's just showing 1 to 6 here. And it's just the personal risk perception. So it's just asking, what do you think your risk is of getting lung cancer? And then I just divided people into 3 groups here on the x-axis. So people answered specifically how many cigarettes they smoked a day, but I lumped everyone who smoked 10 or fewer into a low group, everyone who answered between 11 and 19 cigarettes a day into a medium group, and then anyone who smoked a pack or more into the high group. So as you can imagine, you would expect maybe that people show some sensitivity in their personal risk as a function of how much they smoke, which is an important risk factor. More smoking, more likelihood of lung cancer. So when we looked at the Americans that they survey, they did in fact show this pattern. So they did in fact give a lower personal risk estimate when they smoked less, somewhat higher when they smoked more, and even higher when they smoked a pack of more. So some adjustment to the reality of realizing that smoking more means that you have a higher risk. Now in Denmark, the pattern was absent. So this line kind of looks like it's slanting downward, but it's actually completely flat. So if you're interested in knowing why Danes did not show any adjustment, or in general Danes more so than Americans minimize smoking, you should ask me during the question and answer period. All right, so then you might say, okay, so Danes seem unrealistic and Americans seemed realistic perhaps, but that's only if we don't consider the actual risk. So the actual risk is much, much, much greater. So at all points in time, Americans also underestimated their risk, but particularly the more cigarettes they smoked. So they were vastly underestimating their actual risk, even though they acknowledge some risk. All right, so now we have talked about that people show an optimistic bias. They adjust somewhat to reality, such as news or their own behavior, but they're still biased. So now let's go on to why people show these optimistic biases. So this has been researched a great deal, and I'll just share the one that seems to make the most difference in relationship to the coronavirus, and that's personal experience. So coronavirus can seem distant, even if you read the paper and you read personal accounts of terrible, terrible suffering in other countries. It can still seem just remote because you are not experiencing it and you don't know someone who is experiencing it. So there seems to be a visual experiential component that for many people, even as the crisis is going on worldwide, is not present for them individually. So experience can also lead to changes in imagining oneself as a victim. It's associated with various biases or heuristics, as they're called, such as the availability heuristic and representativeness heuristic, which just refer to cognitive tendencies to be more easily able to imagine that someone is suffering and that someone could eventually become you. In research with my students where we looked at dating violence and risk perceptions about that, we also found that experience actually reduced perceptions of control and increased worry. So both control and worry are associated with optimistic bias. And here we found that experience in and of itself can actually also affect those other factors that then feed in to risk beliefs. So what happens then when risk perceptions, when you actually experience a disaster? So we know from the dating violence study that when people individually experience dating violence, it changed their beliefs about control and worry and perceived risk of experiencing in the future. But I actually also conducted a study having to do with disasters. So in 1994, I was a graduate student at UCLA, and there was a major earthquake in Los Angeles, one of the most devastating that has been for decades. And of course, the first thing after ascertaining that everyone was okay was that I thought we should collect some data on people's earthquake risk beliefs. So I set out to collect data across time, across actually 10 different time periods, both asking the same people over time, but also asking new independent groups. And the primary question I asked them was, what's your likelihood of getting injured in another earthquake? Now, earthquakes actually happen all the time in Los Angeles, but certainly not of the magnitude that occurred here. So the bottom line is that people were not optimistically biased at any point over these 5 months about the risk of injury in a future earthquake. So that's obviously, as you can tell, somewhat surprising, because we do find a consistent bias in people thinking they're less at risk than others. And we certainly found that bias among these participants for all the other risks that we asked about. So we did ask about personal health-related items like stroke and heart attack. We asked about drinking or injury from drinking-related events. And we also asked for other disaster type related events like experience injury from a flood. And again, it seemed like they had no optimistic bias, that they did not recover, you could say, in the 5 months, but they at all times showed the expected and typical optimistic bias about these other events. So essentially, experience made the optimistic bias go away. So remember that everyone in this study had experienced the earthquake. So because everyone who was in Los Angeles was in the study, and everyone experienced it because it was a very large earthquake. So in this study, I don't have this on the slide, we actually also asked them whether they experienced either injury or monetary loss as a result of the earthquake. And people who had further experience with these direct events, like monetary loss and injury, also were even less optimistically biased than the people who had not experienced that. So even in this situation in which everyone experienced the disaster, people still changed their optimistic bias if they had even further personal consequences that they had experienced as a result. So the question then is, does personal experience also reduce optimistic bias for coronavirus risk? And again, that is exactly what I would expect to find. So I would think, but I did not find anyone who had asked this specific question in the earlier studies, but I would definitely expect that personal experience would also reduce the likelihood of people underestimating their risk by having an optimistic bias. All right, so you might wonder, yeah, we have all this talk about risk perceptions, but isn't it more important what people actually do than what they think? And of course, that is true. So we have quite a bit of work on how one should approach life and what is generally a good approach. And we know from psychology that it's generally good to be optimistic. So we would probably be paralyzed otherwise. So imagine getting to your car every morning and putting the key in the door or in the ignition, and then go, today is the day I could be injured or killed in a car accident. It would be paralyzing. So the best option is, of course, that you get in the car and then you don't think that today is the day you're going to die, but you still put on your seatbelt. So that's really the crux of the matter, is what is the relationship between perceived risk and people's health behaviors? So the problem, of course, with thinking you're not at risk is that it might negatively affect your behavior. So if you don't think you're going to get injured in a car accident, maybe that causes you to not put on your seatbelt. If you don't think you're going to fall on your bicycle, maybe that causes you to not wear your helmet. That's a pattern that's very well established by many, many health belief models, namely that your personal beliefs affect, or susceptibility as it's called, affect your behavior. I also find that my studies with smokers, so smokers who thought that their personal risk of lung cancer was lower, were less interested in quitting. We also found this pattern in an honest thesis one of my students did at Dickinson, in which she examined what women who were in a domestic violence shelter, what their risk beliefs were. And we asked them specifically whether they thought they were at risk of being battered again by the person, the batterer, who had put them in the shelter. And the more they thought they were at risk of experience battering again, the more they considered ending their relationship, which in this case was the behavioral outcome. So we weren't able to follow them up and actually see whether they ended their relationship, but they were definitely interested in considering it. So we did in fact see the relationship between that people's risks predicted their behaviors or intentions. So what about coronavirus? So do risk beliefs then predict behaviors? So again, the US study I described earlier on the coronavirus found that personal risk perception was the best predictor of whether people washed their hands or engaged in social distancing. So, and remember, this study was just conducted a few weeks ago. So yes, researchers are working very quickly. Earlier research on the H1N1 virus also showed that personally believing you were at risk predicted engaging in more of these kinds of precautionary or avoidance behaviors. So what's really challenging about studying things during a crisis is that as norms and rules change, we would need to measure other precautionary behaviors other than just hand washing or excuse me, engaging in social distancing. So even the US study, we're already finding what's called ceiling effects on their measures, meaning that even in 2 weeks ago, most people were reporting washing their hands or engaging in social distancing. So what's important as the crisis goes on and more rules are imposed on requiring people to stay at home is that we now need to measure other types of behaviors, like perhaps sanitizing groceries or wearing a mask or other face covering, because we're not seeing variability or movement on these basic ideas. So for example, the UK instituted shelter in place rules about 2 weeks ago. So I don't leave the house much. You're only allowed to leave once a day, either to exercise or buy groceries. So of course my hand washing went down dramatically because I now just wash my hands normally, but I rarely leave the house. So also once people undertake precautionary behaviors, their risk beliefs go down. So their risk perceptions go down. So it's complicated to measure for sure. All right, so I wanted to just briefly talk about a new study that I just started last week. So I began a research project that we are working very hard on to carry out in the next week or two. And I'm actually working with 2 Dickinson alumni who worked in my lab when they were at Dickinson. Laurel Peterson graduated in '06. She's a health social psychologist at Bryn Mawr, and her research examines how race and gender and the social experience of these identities like discrimination, masculinity, gender discrimination affects health, cognitions, and behaviors and physiological processes. And Sarah is a PhD student at NYU in social psychology, and she focuses on political psychology and gender, especially masculinity and precarious manhood. And her work right now focuses on the influence of precarious manhood on political judgment. For full disclosure, I should mention she's also my daughter. So we have a dream team put together in which we're examining the link between coronavirus risk perceptions and preventive behaviors, so much like the research I just described. What's special about this research is that we're actually interested in looking at the gendered and political factors that might influence this relationship. So I can answer more questions about that in the Q&A, but we're specifically looking at masculinity, conservative political orientation, system justification, and other factors. We're asking a lot of questions for sure, because there's so much to examine, and we will have a representative sample of US adults, and we're going to ask them 2 weeks apart, similar or the same questions. So we're very excited about that. So the summary then on risk perception is that people very much worry and think about their risks. People think that they're less at risk than others, but also sometimes over or underestimate their actual risks. If you're interested in getting more examples of this conundrum, I'm happy to give more examples in the Q&A. People rely heavily on their emotions. So when you ask people what their risks are, some research actually suggests that they're really asking about whether they perceive the question being asked as about whether they worry about something. So they're really seeing a risk question as a question about their feelings rather than what a scientist might do, which is to look at objective risk. So people rely on their emotions and personal experiences in judging whether they're at risk or not. People also exhibit other cognitive errors, and they also tend to seek out confirming information to support whatever beliefs they have. So returning then to our initial question, so why did the spring breakers then party on the beach? Well, most likely, certainly, because they underestimated their own risk. They might also have thought that they would be fine, even though they got the coronavirus, or they might not have thought much about the risk of bringing it back to their dorm rooms or their family or grandma. So we in fact do know that college students brought the coronavirus back to their families. It's also possible that the Florida government officials suffered from an optimistic bias. They might have thought this is not likely to happen here or to us. And white men in particular, compared to other groups, are particularly likely to see their own risk as low. And certainly government officials are dominated disproportionately by white men. The students might also have looked to other cues in the environment. So they might have thought that if the beaches are open, it can't be that dangerous. So they might have thought that if there was real danger, the beaches would have been closed. And they might also have looked to other people for cues into whether this was a dangerous situation. And they might have seen the presence of other people as evidence that no one else was worried. So social norms are very important when people are in unknown territory. All right, so I wanted to end by discussing both how experts and lay people differ in their risk beliefs and also what effects that has on risk communication. So experts tend to look at accident probabilities, annual fatalities, cost of preventing some death or some accidents, whereas, as you probably understand from my earlier talk, lay people think much more about whether it feels dangerous, whether they know someone who's experienced it, what it might be like to experience it, and how much control they have. So definitely different perspectives. So experts are different than lay people is that they know a lot more about the specific risk. So they don't necessarily know more about other risks, but they do know a lot about the risk that they're studying. So their knowledge doesn't necessarily generalize. They might be just as emotional and use the same understanding strategies as lay people when it's outside of their own area of expertise. They might also better understand how to interpret information, especially statistics. They are mostly less swayed by their emotions, although not always. They're much better determining which people and sources to trust, but they can also be too quick to dismiss lay people's worries. So there's quite a bit of research on nuclear power plants in which lay people are often very worried about the impact of a low probability but high dread risk, as it would be called, and kind of dismiss lay people's worries because it's a very rare event. But experts can also have a tough time getting or explaining risks to lay people, like smoking is a good example of that, in which many people still think it's not all that dangerous, which is definitely contrary to decades of scientific evidence. So how do we then go about informing the people, which is what experts need to do to talk to lay people? So experts in general are often not good at communicating risk information. They usually need to go on communication courses on some other way, get better at communicating statistics and facts in a way that lay people can understand. I would say one unique thing about the coronavirus is that experts are definitely not used to having their science politicized. So immunologists, virologists, epidemiologists, and all the other experts who in fact exactly understand what is happening or can read the data, I think have been surprised. Perhaps they would have been less surprised if they had talked to their colleagues who study climate science, because they certainly have experienced this kind of politicization of their scientific knowledge. Journalists also, of course, communicate to the public about risk, but rarely do they actually have a science background and necessarily understand statistical information. There's a tendency to, as it says, if it leads, it bleeds, it leads. In other words, journalists might rely heavily not on statistical or accurate information, but rather presenting stories of devastation and tragedy. Of course, politicians and NGOs and philanthropic organizations and so on also have their own agendas and therefore feed people their own spin based on risk. So risk can easily be used to get donations or attention to a cause or other aspects like that. So it's difficult to figure out who to listen to. Risk information might also frighten and frustrate the public. I'm sure that you have all experienced that at some point with the coronavirus. What are people saying? They keep seeming to change information as information is coming in. Now maybe the CDC recommends wearing masks, but why exactly? And what are their arguments? So it's complicated to accurately relay information, and trust is absolutely essential in all of this. So if you don't trust your experts, if you don't trust science, if you don't trust your politicians or leaders of government, you're also going to not trust what they say about risk. All right, so my conclusion then is that strong beliefs in general are hard to modify. And that is certainly true for optimistic bias. It's also hard to change people's risk minimizing beliefs. People have tried for decades to convince smokers that it's dangerous to smoke, and it's just difficult to get people to change their mind. Naive people also easily manipulated. If you start off by believing that it's just the flu, the coronavirus, which it most certainly is not, you might be easily duped into thinking other incorrect things. The perceived risk affects both decision-making and behaviors, both among those who make the decisions and everyone else. And we have seen this in the media with people early on, including those who have a voice, across the world, have minimized the risk when we now know that that was probably not the correct decision. So overall, we really live in what researchers call a risk society. We are constantly bombarded with risk information at the doctor's office. Certainly, you're asked to take pills to reduce your risk. Most companies have risk experts who try to figure out what companies should do. We have online people who try and prevent hacking attempts. Even when I take my students in London to study tour excursions here in the UK, we are first informed about what risks this might be potentially involved in this tour, such as crossing a busy road, getting run over by a bicycle. We were told that if the fire alarm went off, it was not a test case, and so on. So we do live in an environment in which we communicate risk. And even in the best of circumstances, risk is difficult to assess and communicate. We have tried for years to convince people to stop smoking based on risk information. And although we have some successes, it's also in some ways not that successful. And the uncertainty of the coronavirus infection specifically certainly leaves us open to risk minimization and rationalization. So those are my thoughts for today. You can read my article that I wrote about this, 700 words, much shorter than today's presentation. And feel free to share that with others. So you can see the link there, or you can just Google the conversation and battling the coronavirus. Will optimistic bias be our undoing? And you can also read more about my research on my webpage. So now to your questions.
Thank you so much. So we'll now begin the question and answer session. And as a reminder to our viewers, you can type your questions at any time in the chat box next to the live YouTube video. So don't hesitate to send those along. So our first question is in response to the smoking example. The individual wants to know why the people from Denmark don't see a change.
That's a good question. So I have about 5 articles on that I'm not going to make you read. There's a long history of the Danish government being very collaborative with industry, and that includes actually the industry of the tobacco industry, which is fascinating. And there's been a long history also of not interfering with people's individual risk choices unless it was very clear that those choices affected other people. Now, I know what you're all thinking. Certainly, your smoking affects other people, just like you are not taking precautions with the coronavirus could infect other people. And Danes have focused much less on secondhand smoke as a reason for why you shouldn't smoke. So they're focused much more on, probably correctly, the more serious problem, which is you shouldn't smoke because it's going to kill you. So there's a long history, the last 30 or 40 years, of both having fewer interventions like high prices, hiding the tobacco behind the counter, limiting it in schools, so the kind of typical public health measures, than in the United States. And that has led Danes to being actually very skeptical about their risks of smoking. They think it's not a good idea to smoke for sure, but as one of the smokers I interviewed in one of my studies said, I understand that non-smokers find it annoying and that it smells. I totally get that, but I just don't think I'm killing them. In other words, discounting the effects on other people removes a part of the moral calculation that can serve as a justification for limiting people's rights to smoke. And that moral justification has played a much greater role in the United States.
Great, thank you. Our next question is a follow-up about religion and political beliefs. So the question reads, does your research also take into account factors like religious and political beliefs, both of which can affect one's outlook on susceptibility to the coronavirus infection? So specifically, the individual is thinking about the Liberty University example.
Yes. So the short answer to that is no. So what's so exciting about my collaboration with Sarah and Laurel, and why I call it the dream team, is that I never look at political or religious or gendered attitudes and risk. So this is why we have the perfect team, because we together have an opportunity to actually connect each of our three different areas of research. So we do specifically know from the research on masculinity that men are particularly less concerned about their risk. I briefly mentioned the white man effect. And also that they're particularly concerned if they think that undertaking the health behavior will make them look less masculine, so wussy. So that's one aspect. We're particularly also interested in seeing whether there's a match of that in femininity, and we think women are much less concerned about not appearing feminine or femininity beliefs in general affecting their risk beliefs. We have not looked at religious beliefs. I did see an article that mentioned the possibility that although religious beliefs can be protective across many different health behaviors, if you have a strong community that supports making the correct or best health behavior choice. But certainly it can also be detrimental, like the Liberty University example, in which there seemed to be a strong consensus in one particular religious university that the students should return from their study abroad trips and stay on campus, which led to a mini hotspot right at the university. So of course, it's also always hard to know whether that was ultimately a religiously based decision, a conservative or politically based decision, or whether the people in charge were just optimistically biased, like lots of other people have been in this crisis. So great question. So we'll have the answers in, I don't know, 3 weeks. Okay, maybe we need time to analyze the data too.
Great, thank you. The next question is, how does the immediacy of the coronavirus threat affect risk perception?
So actually it affects it quite directly. So the closer you are to the actual event having happened, the more it affects it. So it's actually linear. So I can do a little thought experiment. So let's say that you drive on the freeway and you see a really bad car accident. So how long would you feel unsettled? Like you would feel unsettled, right? Maybe, I don't know, 30 seconds, maybe if it was really bad, 5-10 minutes, maybe if it was terrible, a day. So, but if you experience the accident, it would last much longer, right? So there are people who still suffer from the accidents that they experienced years or decades ago and still feel unsettled when they get in the car. So it's literally the intensity of the experience is what directly affects your reaction in terms of your risk perception. There's also some interesting research that's called bracing for bad news. And they actually did it among college students, in which they asked students 2 days before an exam, and then 1 day before an exam, and then right after the exam, what they thought their grade was. And then they asked them right before they got their grade back, but before looking at it. And the students actually were quite optimistic 2 days before. Then they were a little less optimistic on the day of the exam. They were definitely less optimistic, although still optimistic right after taking the exam, right? So they're getting more and more information. and they were pessimistic about their grade relative to the actual grade, right? So we knew in this research what their actual grade was, and they actually became pessimistic right before moving their hand. So they got the grade back on a piece of paper, and right before moving their hand, they were pessimistically biased. So yes, we are sensitive to research, to information, and when you're going to be getting bad news. So that's why the research is called Bracing for Bad News. So we're quite sensitive to time.
That makes sense. Our next question reads, you mentioned that ongoing research needs to take extra procedures like sanitizing groceries or wearing a mask into account besides just washing hands. So how do you account for potential confounding variables like the shortage of sanitizer and face masks?
It is really, really hard. So we have spent probably 75% of our research meetings on this research project so far just trying to figure out what we should ask. It's particularly really hard for the reason that the question pointed to, namely that you might not be able to do those things, like use hand sanitizer because it's not available. But even more confusing is that you're not, if you're required to stay at home by your state or by your boss or by someone else, you come to think you're less at risk because you're required to stay at home, possibly, but it's not your risk behavior that's driving the decision, right? So we think that your perceived risk is driving, it comes before, it leads to the changes in behavior. But in this case, the change in behavior that didn't come about by your choice, right, because you were ordered to stay at home, is now driving lower risk. And then that lower risk affects your risk changing behaviors, right? So perhaps you don't need to wash your hands at all because you're at home all the time. Perhaps you don't think you're at risk anymore because you rarely leave the house. So my risk estimate has certainly gone down personally because I rarely leave the house anymore. So now my primary way of getting infected is groceries, because that's the only contact we actually have with other people now. So one of the questions we're going to have to look at carefully in the data we collect is where people are located, because the stay-at-home orders are now varying dramatically by state, but also the prevalence and the seriousness is now moving throughout the states in different order, right? So things are maybe a little better in Seattle, they're very bad in New York City, but maybe in 2 weeks, Pennsylvania will be New York City. So the time will matter and how people are reacting in each of their states.
The next question is about additional benefits to the optimistic bias. So what are the benefits, potentially the power of positive thinking? So kind of in addition to what you mentioned previously.
Yeah, so it is actually very important to have a positive outlook on life, and that doesn't mean you should, clearly, the result of this talk today would suggest that you shouldn't be an idiot, right? So you should have a pessimistic, a hopeful outlook on life, and that is very, very beneficial because it reduces your worry and anxiety, which itself is not healthy or good, certainly in excessive amounts. So the tricky part is to have a positive and hopeful outlook on life, and at the same time, not use as an excuse to not take precautionary behaviors, right? So you should get in the car and use your seatbelt and get on your bicycle and enjoy the outside, but still use your helmet and so on. So there are many well-established benefits of having a positive outlook. The trick is to do the right thing and have a positive outlook.
Great. The next question is, how do you recommend finding a balance between the positive outlook and your own personal risk? So how do you maybe determine your own personal risk and kind of balance that?
Yeah, that's a very good question because I ride my bicycle here in Norwich, where I'm currently located, and I also ride my road bike. And that's of course a risk. I wear a helmet, of course, but if a car runs into you, that certainly is dangerous into action. And the roads here are very, very narrow. And of course, the roads here also, people drive in the left side. So there's that. And then the way that you ride here in groups is backwards, not like in a negative way, but just literally backwards from the way that you ride in the US. So that's one of those situations, since I'm a risk researcher, I actually thought about how much more risky this situation seemed. And so the question is, which is very difficult to actually ascertain, is that you should feel positive, obviously, and feel that the positive aspects of this risk-taking is worth it, right, objectively and for you. But you should also, right, so there's the objective benefits that you need to weigh against the actual cost. And if you ultimately, in this case, it's a voluntary behavior, cannot find a way to do that, you should just switch to spinning inside. So that's an example in which you have some control over your actual risk. With a more everyday behavior, I would say that it's just good to have habits. So most of us probably brush our teeth every night going to bed without thinking about the teeth rotting out of your mouth, right? So in this case, you have just made it a habit to brush your teeth, and it's coming to seem natural and normal, the way it is to put on your seatbelt or do something similar to that. And in that sense, making a habit can do the correct behavior, which is brushing your teeth, without it being tied to your risk. So habits are important. And all of you have probably found that you have had to undertake new habits now that you are at home every day. And it takes time to develop new habits and adjust the habits when they're not working anymore.
Great. So the next question is, with distrust in America towards media and scientists, such as maybe regarding climate change, how do we as a society try to build trust? Can we learn anything from Denmark? And this kind of, I guess, relates to your research on Denmark's happiness.
Yeah, so thank you. So Danes do crush the happiness reports year after year after year. They're usually in the top 5. And one of the primary factors of their happiness, other than low income inequality, which is driving much of the unhappiness and the increases in unhappiness in the United States, trust is a major component. And trust here both includes trust in each other, it includes trust in science, and it includes trust in the government. And it's very difficult to figure out how one can establish trust when trust seems to be absent. So I've been asked this question before, and I actually don't know that I have any great suggestions for how one can establish trust. Perhaps the only suggestion I can think of is to try and start small. So try and start not with the whole country, but try and start perhaps with your family or your community. So think about how you can establish trust in this town you live in. Can you establish communication channels that, despite people's objective and reasonable differences about how to solve problems that fall along a political line, can we still find ways to listen to and trust that other people have legitimate perspectives, and that sometimes we actually have the same goals in mind, like improving the economy or reducing unemployment or making sure that vulnerable people get the help that they need. So start small to think about which conversations you could better accomplish in a way that shows that you can build trust and connections with other people, even though those people that you disagree with, maybe even quite a bit.
Great, thank you. So that is all the questions we've received. So that will conclude today's program. We thank everyone for viewing, and have a great day.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.